look around. Have you ever seen these contemporary guidelines? Just imagine you scroll down your webpage and you've stuck into plenty of different articles which tell you the same things. For decades, LDL has been touted as bad cholesterol since it collects in your artery walls and leads to a buildup of plaque known as atherosclerosis. On the other hand, HDL is a good one as it helps rid your body of excess cholesterol, so it's less likely to end up in your arteries. And first, you need to reduce LDL and raise HDL levels, but is it that plain and simple? As you recall, cholesterol does not travel on its own. It needs special vessels, which are called lipoproteins. And before we delve into the correlation between HDL and LDL cholesterol, we need to understand how these ships are created. Generally, the handling of lipoprotein particles in the body is referred to as lipoprotein particle metabolism, and it's divided into two pathways, endogenous and exogenous, depending on whether they are composed of dietary lipids or originated in the liver. Okay, anything that you eat firstly gets into your stomach, and that semi-fluid mass of partly digested food is called chyme. It slowly passes into the small intestine where the extraction of nutrients begins. It's covered with villi, small finger-like projections which have a great deal of enterocytes on their surface. But there is a problem. Triglycerides or fats are too bulky to pass through them. That's why they need to be emulsified by bile and hydrolyzed into the mixture of fatty acids and monoglycerides. These then pass from the intestinal lumen into the enterocyte where they are re-esterified to form triglycerides again. They are ultimately combined with phospholipids, cholesterol esters, and apolipoproteins to form chylomicrons, which create a milky substance known as chyle. By the way, did you ever know why milk has its characteristic appearance? Actually, both the fat globules and the small occasional cells, which are just large enough to deflect light, contribute to the opaque white color. That process is called light scattering by particles, aka diffuse reflection. I told you that because of the chyle's resemblance to milk due to its chylomicron content. Let's continue. Meanwhile, our precious ships are subject to dilapidation by an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. Eventually, as they have shed much of their triglyceride cargo, they can be taken up by the liver. Right there, the fat released from chylomicron remnants can be re-exported to the blood as a triglyceride component of very low density lipoproteins. And the vicious cycle begins. I guess you already know about the inevitable fate of this poor energy carriers. If not, you can check my last video. But now, let's discuss the high density lipoprotein cholesterol. Do we really need it? HDL particles traffic, guess what? Cholesterol. They circulate in plasma for 5 days as a ready reserve. In fact, almost no cell in humans require delivery of cholesterol. They synthesize all they need. However, teratogenic hormone-producing tissues like adrenal cortex and gonads do require cholesterol, and the HDL particle is the primary delivery truck. As in case of medical emergency, the adrenal gland must rapidly make a lot of cortisone. This explains why low HDL cholesterol typically seen in patients with severe infections and inflammatory conditions. So, the number one place for cholesterol influx is adrenal cortex and gonads. But liver, adipocytes, and small intestine also play their role. But HDL is also able to give its cholesterol to ApoB particles, 90% of which are LDLs, to return to the liver. It is possible due to the action of cholesterol ester transfer protein, abbreviated as CETP, which facilitates the transport of cholesterol esters from the high to the low density lipoproteins. But here goes an important note. An HDL particle delivering cholesterol to the liver is called direct reverse cholesterol transport, also known as RCT, whereas an ApoB particle returning to the liver is indirect RCT. Hence, the total reverse cholesterol transport equals direct RCT plus indirect one. But keep in mind, LDLs actually perform the majority of total RST. In other words, the bad lipoprotein does more of the cleaning up than the good one. And with all that being said, HDL particle needs to get its cholesterol out of somewhere. Thus, the majority of lipidation, or efflux, occurs at the liver, the small intestine, adipocytes, and peripheral cells, including plaque if present. The first two account for 95% of this process. However, the amount of cholesterol pulled out of uterus, also known as macrophage RST, is actually negligible, since it has no effect on serum HDL levels. Even in patients with extensive plaque, the cholesterol there is about 0.5% of the total content. Anyway, it is crucial for cardiovascular disease prevention, since you do not need a lot of cholesterol to get out of artery walls to save your life. Now you possibly think, I need a plenty of HDL cholesterol in my body. The more the better, isn't it? Not really. And I mean the death of HDL hypothesis. Technically, the whole buzz started with a drug called tocetrapib. It was capable of increasing HDL cholesterol levels because it blocked the cholesterol acid transfer protein, which we have already discussed. Consequently, the less the exchange between the particles, the higher the HDL content, and it was indeed kind of effective, but it had some unanticipated side effects like raising blood pressure and altering the electrolyte balance. That's why the net impact was harmful. Subsequently, the trial was immediately halted. 2 years later, another drug, a cousin of tocetrapib called dalcetrapib, although a weaker CETP inhibitor, appeared to do all the right stuff without the wrong one. It did nothing to LDL cholesterol or the amount of ApoB containing particles. As a result, patients on the treatment arm did experience a significant decrease in HDL cholesterol but failed to appreciate any clinical benefit. Okay, in that case, let's refer to something more familiar, for example, niacin or vitamin B3. It has long been known to raise HDL levels and has actually been used therapeutically for this reason for many years. That trial randomly assigned over 3,000 patients with known and persistent cardiovascular risk to one of two treatments. The first one is a combination of statin, a medication blocking the special enzyme which is necessary to synthesize endogenous cholesterol, and ezetimibe, which works on the other end of the problem, blocking the cholesterol absorption by the enterocytes. Another arm of the study was also given an extended release niacin. After 2 years, as expected, the niacin group had experienced a significant increase in plasma HDL cholesterol. However, there was no improvement in patient survival. Another futile trial. And the last nail in the casket of the entire HDL hypothesis was the Mendelian randomization. In the case of that research, pulled data from tens of studies where patients were known to have myocardial infarction or heart attacks were mapped against known genetic alterations called single nucleotide polymorphisms, pronounced SNPs. The reason for doing that analysis was to ferret out if having a high HDL cholesterol was only correlated with the better cardiovascular outcome, which has been the classic teaching. That study found that patients with higher HDL cholesterol did not seem to have protection from heart disease as a result of that gene. All in all, we've been told for years by erroneous extrapolation from epidemiologic data that 1% rise in HDL cholesterol will translate into 3% reduction in coronary artery disease. These trials would suggest otherwise. I think it's exactly the time to discuss the difference between size and number, as they are not the same things. I suppose you remember the chart from the previous video, which divided low-density lipoproteins into 3 groups: large, medium, and small. The less the size, the more atherogenic they are. As for high-density lipoproteins, they have kinda similar classification depending on the relative cholesterol content, but there is something else going on here? If you look at the figure below from the Framingham cohort, you'll know something interesting. As you can see, for increases at high density lipoprotein cholesterol at low levels, the increase in small particles seems to account for much of the rise in total number, while for increases over 40 milligrams per deciliter, the increase in large particles seems to account for the rise in size. Also note, there is almost no further increase in total number. This reveals to us that small HDL particles are being lipidated. But is there any reason to favor them over large ones? Yep, and not only one. It seems a smaller HDL particle is better at transporting cholesterol from the subendothelial space elsewhere. Technically, they acquire it from the cholesterol-laden macrophages or foam cells, better at reducing inflammation, better at preventing clotting, and better at mitigating the problems caused by oxidative free radicals. Now, let's sum up everything we've discussed so far. As for low-density lipoprotein particles, their number is the key driving factor of atherosclerosis, but we can further specify the risk depending on their size. And as for HDL particles, the rule is the same. Firstly, you need to determine their number and only then the size. But the truth is that all lipoproteins in the organism are in a constant state of lipidation and delipidation, also known as flux. That process is mediated by the two main transfer proteins. First is CETP, which has always been the subject to inhibition. And it's kinda weird because that study found that the relative risk of coronary heart disease was at least 1.5 times more in men with decreased CETP activity and increased HDL cholesterol levels. So we need to fret about the other one, a phospholipid transfer protein, abbreviated as PLTP, which facilitates transport of phospholipids from the low to the high density lipoproteins. For example, that study suggests that PLTP deficiency reduces cardiovascular disease while its overexpression induces it. And the last research concludes that lower plasma CETP or higher PLTP activity was each associated with a significantly increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And this is not surprising since phospholipid transfer protein decreases LDL and increases HDL size, making the things worse. On the other hand, cholesterol ester transfer protein does exactly the opposite. Whew. Finally, the bottom line. To decrease the risk of cardiovascular events, you need to keep the amount of LDL particles as low as possible, increasing the cholesterol contained in there. As for high-density lipoprotein particles, you need to rise the number of them while holding their size. This can be only achieved by keeping the HDL cholesterol at relatively low levels, approximately 40 milligrams per deciliter. So, what can you say about the contemporary guidelines right now? I hope I've helped you change your mind. See ya!